On September 6th, 1946, an airliner flying from New York to San Francisco unfortunately crashed, killing everyone on board except a 2-year-old baby boy called Peter Link. Therefore, an all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful God impregnated a virgin with himself, so that he could later sacrifice himself to save you from a sin that you didn't personally commit. Makes sense, right? Jokes aside, the argument from miracles is one of the most requested videos that you've asked for, and so, here it is. The argument from miracles debunked. So let's begin, as we always do, by clearly presenting the argument. Simply stated, the argument from miracles asserts that the occurrence of miracles prove that a very specific God exists, normally being a variation of the Abrahamic God. And it defines a miracle as an extraordinary and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws, and is therefore attributed to divine agency. Or, in the eternal words of David Hume, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as such it's necessarily supernatural. It's an intentional, supernatural intervention. A few examples of asserted miracles include Jesus Christ rising from the dead, Muhammad splitting the moon, Moses parting the Red Sea, Zeus defeating Kronos, Thor defeating the frost giants, statues of Ganesha drinking milk offerings, and of course, the classic almighty creator of the universe imprinting himself on some dude's toast. Because, you know, reasons. Now there are only really two ways to refute a miraculous claim. The first is to address the specific miracle being asserted, and the second is to address miracles as a whole. The problem with the first approach is that even if you're able to debunk the assertion and convince the proponent that they are mistaken, the mode of thought that caused them to believe in the miracle in the first place remains, and so they'll almost certainly ram another miraculous claim down your throat within seconds, normally primed with the words, okay, well what about this miracle? But if, on the other hand, you're able to successfully convince the proponent that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that no amount of anecdotal testimonies would ever be enough to prove that a certain miracle actually happened, you would have essentially chopped the tree at its roots, and in doing so, likely purged their religious beliefs entirely, let alone their beliefs in miracles. And that, my friends, is actually the problem. Miracles are to religion what pens are to paper. They are predicated on one another, and so the chances of you convincing a proponent that as of yet, not a single suspension of the laws of nature has been scientifically documented is remarkably slim. But hell to it, let's give it a go anyway. So the first flaw to reveal, in my not so humble opinion, is that the vast majority of miracles wouldn't prove the existence of God even if they were indeed true. Or in other words, they don't support theism. For example, even if it were unimpeachably true that a man called Jesus resurrected, this would not, in the slightest, prove that the universe had a creator. Nor would it prove that Jesus turned water into wine, that he healed the blind, that he walked on water, or that he was born of a virgin. All it would prove is that a man called Jesus respawned, and that he had terrible lag because it took him 3 days. Likewise, even if it was unimpeachably proven that Peter Link was indeed saved by a divine intervention, it would not logically follow that a man called Jesus resurrected. Nor would it logically follow that a man called Muhammad split the moon, or that a god called Zeus defeated Kronos. This just isn't how logic works. But unfortunately, most proponents of miracles implicitly do think that this is how logic works, and to demonstrate this, here's but one example from Frank Turek.
And if it is true that that Jesus really did come and say and do the things that the New Testament writer said he did, then whatever he teaches is true, because if he rose from the dead, he was God. If he taught that there will be an intervention, then there will be. That's the argument. I don't have time to support it.
I bet you don't. Anyhow, to reiterate, even if true, the vast majority of miracles wouldn't prove the existence of a God, let alone the existence of a very specific interpretation of a very specific God. With this acknowledged, the second and perhaps most obvious flaw with miracles is that they either commit an argument from ignorance or a personal incredulity fallacy. To illustrate this, consider the following. Throughout history there have been numerous accounts of flightless animals raining from the sky, and needless to say, on just about every occasion, someone somewhere has asserted that a miracle has occurred, because there's no other explanation. Now of course, it's fair to say that flightless animals don't just fall from the sky, but one can't simply assert that a miracle has occurred simply because there's no other explanation. That would be, and is, an outrageous argument from ignorance. It is, in essence, we don't know, therefore God. Anyhow, as it turns out, we now actually do have an adequate explanation, which, by the way, perfectly demonstrates why arguments from ignorance are flawed. This explanation is, quite simply, a tornado that's formed over a body of water, otherwise known as a waterspout, that's then hurled water and aquatic animals over land. It's a bizarre phenomenon, incredible even, but it's not a miracle because it doesn't violate the laws of nature. Yet, despite the fact that we now know exactly how flightless animals can rain from the sky, many people still assert that the only explanation is divine intervention, because they either don't personally know about waterspouts or they don't understand them, which, as you may or may not know, isn't an argument from ignorance, but rather it's a personal incredulity fallacy. And this brings us comfortably to a necessary question that is extremely effective at exposing a third fallacy that ravishes miraculous assertions. This question is, how exactly can we distinguish a miracle from an unlikely natural occurrence that we are yet to comprehend? It's a very simple question, but it's a brilliant one, if I do say so myself, because it forces the proponent to bear their burden of proof, rather than allowing them to shift it to you by appealing to ignorance. And if they can't, and instead they either attempt to shift the burden of proof to you, or they simply appeal to ignorance, then guess what? Their assertion is unsubstantiated, and therefore their argument is too, meaning that it's game over. No ifs, no buts, it's over. And finally, the last aspect of miracles we'll briefly cover is the low-hanging but incredibly popular fruit that is faith healers, or more accurately, reprehensible charlatans. To do this, I'm going to show you a clip from Darren Brown's Miracles for Sale, which is a fantastic show that I highly recommend.
If you are Indian, you are hard of hearing, I want you to come up here. You, come here. You hard of hearing?
This man says he's partially deaf in one ear, which Pastor Sean is quick to express as a more major affliction.
You can't hear nothing. Oh my God. Somebody shout, be open! Be open!
After the healing moment, it seems as if something miraculous has occurred. To prove the man's deaf ear had been healed, Pastor Sean had him face away so he couldn't lip read and had his assistant block his good ear. But from this camera angle, you can see that the man's good ear isn't being blocked at all. So maybe it's not such a miracle.
Now, the point of me showing you this clip is to predominantly point out two additional fallacies that are rampant in miraculous claims. The first is the appeal to emotion fallacy, which occurs when Pastor Sean manipulates both the recipient's and the crowd's emotions by shouting and invoking their deeply held beliefs. And the second is the anecdotal fallacy, which occurs after the show when a crowd member asserts that they witnessed a miracle, when they didn't. The charlatan simply lied about the extent of the recipient's condition, and then presented evidence of things that the recipient could already do as if he couldn't. Now, we could go on here, but I'm going to save faith healers for an entire video later down the line. Until then, if you want more information, be sure to check out Darren Brown's content. He's simply marvellous. So, to recap, the argument from miracles is flawed because, even if true, the vast majority of miracles don't support theism, let alone a specific religion. Most commit either an argument from ignorance or a personal incredulity fallacy. Most attempt to shift the burden of proof, and many, but not all, commit an appeal to emotion and or an anecdotal fallacy. Now, just before we conclude, I have a few awesome announcements to make. The first is that I have this brand new laptop, which has been half paid for by me and half by my very generous patrons, and so I just want to say an enormous thank you. This beast makes editing much more enjoyable for me, so thank you. Seriously, thank you very, very much. And the second announcement is that there are 3 winners to this month's giveaway rather than 1, to make up for the fact that I've been a bit remiss over the last few months. Sorry, by the way. The first book is The Origin of Species, and by random draw it goes to, you might not believe me, Cosmic Skeptic. Congratulations. You've probably got this book. Okay. And the second book is Predictably Irrational, and it goes to Joshua Welsh. Congratulations, bud. One of my first patrons. Thank you very much, sir. And the third book is Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, classic, which you've probably all got. Anyhow, the winner is... where is it? There it is. Benjamin Marty. Congrats, bud. Also someone that's been with me for a long time. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view. And this time, I'm going to leave you with some of the most impactful words I've ever heard on the topic of miracles. And they come from one of my favourite people on this planet, Matt Dillahunty. Enjoy.
Your position, to the extent that I understand it, because you haven't got a kind of a straight answer yet, is one where there is a God who has an important message for mankind. And somehow, he only reveals it to certain individuals who then write this down, and thousands of years after this initial revelation, we have to rely on copies of translations of copies by anonymous authors with no originals, and a textual testimony to a miracle, for example, the loaves and fishes. There's no amount of reports, anecdotal testimonial reports, that could be sufficient to justify believing that this event actually happened as reported. No amount. And anything that would qualify as a god would clearly understand this, and if it wanted to convey this information to people in a way that was believable, would not be relying on text to do so. And this, for me, is the nail in the coffin for Christianity.